Hi Realtors, this is Lindsay Jackson, your Chief Advocacy Officer at SCR. I'm coming to you again from the Statehouse this week as we've just completed week 9 of the legislative session. This week, the major focus at the Statehouse was the House's budget process. The House came into session on Monday this week to start their debate on the floor. On Tuesday, they worked into the evening to give the bill a second reading and came back on Wednesday to give the bill the third and final reading. Major highlights from the budget include increasing the state's reserves. This week, the House added $122 million to the General Reserve Fund, which exceeds the constitutionally required $34 million contribution. Additionally, the House added $13.6 million to fully fund the Capital Reserve Fund. These additions bring South Carolina's total reserves to $869 million. The House also appropriated $50 million to begin a statewide disaster relief and resilience reserve account. These funds can be used for disaster relief assistance, hazard mitigation, infrastructure improvements, and statewide resilience planning. The House also looked at tax relief in the state budget. They allocated $877 million worth of tax relief. $128 million of that for a one-time $100 non-refundable income tax credit for every return filed with at least $100 in income tax liability. They also set aside $120 million of recurring funds for an income tax cut. This figure represents a 0.2% reduction of the top income tax bracket from 7% to 6.8%. The House also allocated $629 million in direct property tax relief through the Tax Relief Trust Fund. This would be a $29 million increase over the last year. Other highlights from the budget include teacher salary increases. The House allocated $213 million to give every teacher in the state a $3,000 pay raise. While the House was working on the budget this week, the Senate continued to move on their calendar. Many of SCR's top legislative priorities were passed in the Senate this week. S690, dealing with updated LIDAR flood mapping, got a third reading in the Senate this week and now moves on to the House to begin the committee process. H3998, dealing with senior and workforce affordable housing, passed the Senate this week with amendments, and it now heads to the House for their concurrence. H4811, dealing with wing walls, was also given a third reading in the Senate this week. It was enrolled for ratification and now heads to the governor's desk for his signature. S868, dealing with updates to the Beachfront Management Act and definitions of a primary oceanfront sand dune, also received a third reading in the Senate this week, and it now moves on to the House to begin the committee process. 2 SCR legislative priorities were also moving in Senate committees this week. H4431, dealing with business license fee reform, was heard Thursday morning by the Senate Finance, Sales, and Income Tax Subcommittee. The subcommittee gave the bill a favorable report, and it now heads to the full Senate Finance Committee for their consideration. Also in committee this week, S1103, dealing with extending the moratorium on petroleum pipeline companies, was heard and given a favorable report. The bill now heads to the full Senate Judiciary Committee for their consideration. So that wraps up week 9 of the legislative session. Stay tuned next week as I bring you the latest news on what's happening at the South Carolina Statehouse. Thanks and have a great weekend.